The North Sea raged like a living beast, its gray waters clawing at the longship's hull as Astrid pressed herself against the wooden planks, her fingers working methodically through a torn sail. The autumn storm had been brewing for hours, and while the raiders cursed and struggled with the oars, she alone seemed to understand what the shifting winds meant. "Useless mouth," spat Gunnar, the raid leader, his weathered face twisted with contempt as he watched her delicate fingers threading sinew through canvas. "Should have left you on the shore with the other corpses." Astrid didn't respond. 3 moons had passed since they dragged her from her burning village on the Scottish coast, and she'd learned that silence was her shield. Let them think her weak. Let them dismiss her as just another burden from their failed raid. While they saw only a slight girl with dark hair and foreign features, she saw everything: the way the ship listed to starboard when the wind shifted, how the seasoned planks groaned differently before a storm broke, which of the crew secretly feared drowning more than dying in battle. "The sail's nearly ready," she said quietly, her Norwegian accented but clear. She'd picked up their tongue with the same careful attention she gave to reading weather patterns. "Ready for what?" Bjorn, Gunnar's second, laughed bitterly. "We're riding straight into Thor's hammer. That storm will crack us like an egg." But Astrid was already moving, her bare feet sure on the slick deck despite the ship's violent rocking. "Not if we adjust our heading. The wind's shifting northwest, can't you feel it? There's a lee current running parallel to the coast." The men exchanged glances, some mocking, others uncertain. Over the past weeks, her quiet observations had saved them from running aground twice and helped them avoid a Frankish patrol that would have meant death for them all. Still, Gunnar's pride chafed at taking guidance from a slave. "Listen to her," urged Eric, the youngest raider, his face green from seasickness. "She knows things. She knows nothing." Gunnar roared, though his knuckles were white as he gripped the tiller. "I've sailed these waters since before she drew breath." A massive wave crashed over the bow, sending icy spray across the deck. Astrid felt the ship shudder beneath her feet, heard the dangerous creaking of stressed timber. Without permission, she began untying one of the guide ropes. "What are you doing?" Gunnar demanded. "Saving your lives," she replied, hauling on the line with surprising strength. "Help me, or we'll be drinking seawater before the sun sets." For a moment, the only sounds were the howling wind and groaning wood. Then Eric rushed to help her, followed reluctantly by 2 others. Together, they adjusted the sail's angle, catching a crosswind that pulled them away from the worst of the storm's fury. As the longship settled into a steadier rhythm, riding the current Astrid had spotted, Gunnar's jaw worked silently. Around them, the crew began to relax slightly, though the storm was far from over. "You read the water like a seer," Eric murmured, wiping spray from his eyes. Astrid shook her head. "My father was a fisherman. I learned to watch the signs before I learned to walk." The words came out before she could stop them, a rare glimpse into the life they'd stolen from her. "And now you're nothing," Gunnar said harshly, reasserting his authority. "Don't forget that, girl. We feed you scraps and let you live, but you're still just cargo to be sold." But his words carried less venom than before, and Astrid noticed how his eyes kept drifting to the horizon, checking the wind direction exactly as she'd taught him. The storm raged around them, but the ship held steady, following her guidance toward safe harbor. As night fell and the worst of the weather passed, she huddled near the mast, listening to the crew's low conversations. They spoke of reaching Bergen soon, of the great assembly gathering there for winter court. A new king had taken the throne after the old one's death. Kjell Thorson, they called him, a young warrior who'd united several fractious clans through both diplomacy and strength. "They say he's different from his father," Eric was saying. "More interested in trade than raids. Some of the jarls aren't pleased." "Good for trade, bad for us," Bjorn replied. "Fewer wars mean fewer slaves to sell." Astrid closed her eyes, trying not to think about the markets of Bergen, the auction blocks where human lives were bought and sold like cattle. But sleep wouldn't come, not with the ship still riding the tail of the storm and her mind racing with thoughts of escape. When dawn broke gray and cold, the Norwegian coast appeared through the mist like a promise of land. Astrid had never seen anything so beautiful. Towering fjords that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds, their sides covered in evergreen forests that spoke of deep roots and ancient strength. This was a land that bred hard people, she realized, people who carved their place from stone and storm. There, Gunnar pointed toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a protected bay. Bergen, End of the line for you, girl. But as they navigated the narrow harbor entrance, Astrid felt something shift inside her chest. She'd spent 3 months learning their language, their customs, their weaknesses. She'd kept them alive through storms and saved them from enemies. If this was to be her fate, she wouldn't meet it as the broken creature they expected. The harbor was crowded with ships, long ships like theirs, but also broader trading vessels from the south and east. The town beyond buzzed with activity as merchants and warriors prepared for the great assembly. Somewhere in that crowd was a king who might be different, who might see value in something other than gold and steel. As they tied up at a wooden pier, Astrid made herself a promise. She would not go quietly to the slave markets. Whatever strength she had left, whatever knowledge she'd gained, she would use it all to forge her own path. The raiders had brought her here as cargo, but she would leave as something else entirely. Move, Gunnar ordered, gesturing toward the gangplank. Time to see what you're worth. Astrid stood slowly, her chin raised despite the chains around her wrists. More than you know, she said quietly, though only the wind heard her words. The great assembly awaited, and with it a king who spoke of change. Perhaps in a land built on strength, there was room for a different kind of power to take root. The slave market of Bergen reeked of unwashed bodies, fear, and desperation. Astrid stood on the wooden platform, her wrists bound but her spine straight, watching potential buyers examine her like livestock. 3 days had passed since their arrival, and still no one had made an offer. Too small for heavy labor, too foreign-looking for a household servant, too intelligent for her own good. She heard the whispered assessments and felt a grim satisfaction at their dismissal. 20 pieces of silver, called out a gap-toothed merchant. More as a joke than a serious bid. For sewing and light work, 15, countered a farmer with dirt-stained hands. She looks like she'd break in a strong wind. Gunnar's face had grown increasingly dark as the days wore on. The other slaves from their raid had sold quickly, strong men for the mines, young women for pleasure houses, but Astrid remained, an unwanted reminder of a raid gone wrong. Perhaps I should have left you in Scotland after all, he muttered, counting his meager profits. That's when the crowd began to murmur and part. Astrid looked up to see a figure approaching through the press of people, and her breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary buyer. King Kjell Thorson moved with the controlled grace of a seasoned warrior, but his eyes held an intelligence that set him apart from the brutal men she'd known. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark gold hair braided back from a face marked by both strength and thought, he wore fine wool and silver arm rings that spoke of wealth and status. But it was the way he looked at people, really looked at them, as if seeing beyond surface appearances, that made Astrid's pulse quicken. Behind him walked 2 companions, a grizzled warrior who could only be his bodyguard and a sharp-faced woman in rich furs who carried herself like nobility. Your Majesty, Gunnar stammered, dropping into an awkward bow. I didn't expect, that is, we have some fine specimens today. I'm not here to buy, Kjell said, his voice carrying clearly across the market square. His gaze swept over the remaining slaves, pausing briefly on each face. When those pale blue eyes met Astrid's, she felt an electric jolt of recognition, as if he could see straight through to her soul. Then why? Gunnar began, but fell silent as the king stepped closer to the platform. You're the girl they speak of in the harbor taverns, Kjell said directly to Astrid. The one who guided a ship through the storm 3 nights past? Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd hoped her small acts of navigation had gone unnoticed, but apparently sailors talked, and word had a way of reaching important ears. I did what was necessary to survive. Your Majesty, she replied carefully, her Norwegian steady despite her racing pulse. Astrid, is it? At her surprised nod, he continued. News travels fast in a harbor town. They say you read weather like a saga singer reads runes, that you kept a crew of experienced raiders from drowning. Lucky guesses, Gunnar interjected hastily. The girl has some small skill with rope and sail, nothing more. But Kjell ignored him, his attention fixed on Astrid. What's your birth name? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in months. Moira, she said softly. Moira of Kinloss. Scottish coast, the woman behind him observed. Indeed, Lady Sigrid. Kjell nodded to his companion, then looked back at Astrid. And what would Moira of Kinloss do if she were free? It was a dangerous question, one that could be a trap or a test. Astrid felt the weight of every eye in the market upon her, but Kjell's gaze was steady and patient, as if he genuinely wanted to hear her answer. "I would find a way to use what I know," she said finally. "The sea, the weather, languages. I speak Gaelic, Norse, and some Frankish. I can read the old runes my grandmother taught me and calculate the tides by the moon's face." "Useful skills," Kjell mused, though his tone remained neutral. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at this harbor?" Astrid glanced toward the water, her mind automatically cataloging what she observed. "The morning mist is lifting from the northeast, which means fair weather for 2 days, maybe 3. The tide's at 3/4 full, good for loading heavy cargo but turning soon. That Frankish cog in the far berth has a slight list to starboard. Either they're carrying unbalanced weight or taking on water." She paused, realizing she might have said too much, but Kjell gestured for her to continue. "The wind's steady from the west, perfect for any ship heading to the Orkneys or Ireland. But by evening it'll shift south. I can tell by how the gulls are flying. Any captain planning departure should wait for dawn." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Gunnar looked impressed despite himself. "Remarkable," Lady Sigrid said, her tone carrying new respect. "How long have you studied the sea?" "All my life," Astrid replied. "My father said the ocean speaks to those willing to listen. I've been listening since I could walk." Kjell was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke again, his words sent shockwaves through the market square. "Gunner of the Blood Eagle," he said formally, "I claim right of royal intervention in this sale." The raider's face went white. "Your Majesty, surely, the girl is no longer your property to sell. By ancient law and my authority as king, I take responsibility for her welfare and future." Gasps echoed around the square. Royal intervention in slave sales was rare, usually reserved for matters of state security or noble blood. For a king to claim a foreign captive was almost unheard of. "Your Majesty," Lady Sigrid said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No need." Kjell's voice carried absolute authority. "Let all Bergen hear what I say next." He stepped closer to the platform, his eyes never leaving Astrid's face. "Moira of Kinloss, I do not claim you as slave or thrall. I claim you as my ward under the protection of the crown. You will serve in my court, with the understanding that your service is temporary and voluntary. When the spring ships sail, if you choose to leave, you may go with my blessing and sufficient gold to make your own way." The market square erupted in shocked conversation. Ward status was almost unknown for captives, typically reserved for noble children or political hostages. It meant protection, respect, and eventual freedom. Astrid felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible over the crowd's noise. Kjell smiled then, the first true smile she'd seen from him. "Because I've learned to recognize value when I see it, and because the storms ahead will require every skilled navigator I can find." His words carried layers of meaning she didn't fully understand, but the warmth in his voice, the respect in his treatment of her, spoke of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "I accept your protection, Your Majesty," she said formally, though her voice shook with emotion. "Good." He turned to his bodyguard. "Olaf, see that Lady Moira is properly housed and clothed. Lady Sigrid will arrange suitable quarters in the women's hall. Lady Moira." The title felt strange and wonderful on her ears. As the king turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her one more time. "The thing begins in 5 days. I may have need of your skills before then." "What kind of skills, Your Majesty?" His smile turned enigmatic. "The kind that keep ships afloat in stormy weather, Lady Moira. And some storms, I suspect, have nothing to do with wind and rain." As Kjell and his retinue departed, leaving a buzzing crowd in their wake, Astrid realized her life had just changed forever. The chains around her wrists felt suddenly weightless, though they hadn't been removed. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. The great assembly was coming, bringing together the most powerful people in Norway. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a slave, but as a ward of the king, a position that might, if she proved herself worthy, become something even greater. The royal hall buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a sayax blade. Astrid, now Lady Moira as she was known at court, stood behind a carved pillar close enough to hear every word but far enough to avoid notice. 5 days had passed since King Kjell claimed her as his ward, and she was beginning to understand that the storm clouds gathering over Bergen had little to do with weather. The young king grows too bold, she heard Jarl Magnus grumble to his companions. The massive man's voice carried easily across the hall despite his attempt at discretion. First, he reduces our tribute quotas, now he speaks of limiting the slave trade. Where will it end? With us poor as thralls and twice as powerless, replied Jarl Erik the Red, whose nickname came from more than just his hair color. My grandfather raided from Greenland to Constantinople. Are we to become shopkeepers and farmers instead of warriors? Astrid frowned, filing away their words. In her week at court, she'd observed the growing divide between King Kjell's vision of a more prosperous, trade-focused Norway and the old guard's preference for the traditional ways of raiding and conquest. The tension was escalating as more jarls arrived for the thing. Lady Moira, a voice said softly behind her. She turned to find Ragnhild, one of Lady Sigrid's serving women, approaching with a worried expression. The king requests your presence in his private chambers immediately. Astrid's stomach tightened. She'd spoken with Kjell only twice since her claiming. Both brief encounters focused on her observations about weather patterns and ship movements in the harbor. What could he want with such urgency? She followed Ragnhild through the maze of corridors that connected the royal compound, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and timber carvings that seemed to watch her passage with wooden eyes. The October wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and reminding everyone that winter approached fast. King Kjell's private study was warmer than the Great Hall, heated by a crackling fire and lit by carefully placed oil lamps. Maps covered every available surface. Sea charts, territorial boundaries, trade routes marked in different colored inks. The king himself stood behind a large table, studying a detailed representation of the Norwegian coast. Your Majesty, Astrid said, offering the curtsy she'd been taught Moira. He looked up, and she was struck again by the intelligence in his pale eyes. Thank you for coming quickly. I have need of your expertise. How may I serve, Your Majesty? Instead of answering immediately, Kjell gestured toward the maps. Tell me what you see. Astrid approached the table cautiously. The chart before her showed the coastline from Trondheim to Bergen, marked with numerous symbols she didn't recognize. I see shipping routes, she said slowly. But also military positions? These marks here, she pointed to small shield symbols. They're not natural harbors. Fortified positions, Kjell confirmed grimly. My spies report unusual activity along our northern borders. Ships gathering where they shouldn't be. Warriors being assembled under various pretenses. Invasion? The word escaped before she could stop it. Perhaps. Or perhaps simply pressure from those who disagree with my policies. His jaw tightened. Some of my own jarls believe I've grown soft, that I value trade over tradition. They may be testing my resolve. Astrid studied the map more carefully, her mind working through the tactical implications. These positions here and here. She traced routes with her finger. They could blockade the major shipping lanes. Stop trade cold. Exactly. Kjell moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the pine soap he used and the subtle scent of the oils used to maintain his leather and mail. What troubles me more is the timing. Why now, just before the thing? To force your hand? Astrid suggested. Create a crisis that demands the old solutions. Military response, increased raiding to offset trade losses. Kjell's smile was sharp and approving. Lady Sigrid said you were quick. She was right. His expression sobered. What I'm about to share with you must remain absolutely confidential. Can I trust your discretion? With my life, Your Majesty. 3 days ago, I received word from one of my most trusted scouts. A large fleet has assembled in the northern waters, at least 20 longships plus supply vessels. They fly no single banner, but their crews include men I recognize. Men who should be preparing for winter, not mounting expeditions. The implications hit Astrid like a physical blow. You think your own jarls are behind this? I think some of them are willing to risk civil war rather than accept change. Kjell's voice was heavy with the weight of leadership. Tomorrow the thing begins. If I accuse them openly without proof, I divide the kingdom. If I ignore the threat, they may move against loyal settlements while we debate politics. Astrid stared at the map, her mind racing through possibilities. You need intelligence. Real-time information about their positions and intentions. Yes, but how? My scouts are good, but they can't be everywhere. And anyone I send north will be noticed by now. An idea began to form in Astrid's mind. Dangerous, but potentially brilliant. Your Majesty, what if the information came to you instead of your men going to find it? Explain. These ships, they need supplies, especially if they're planning extended operations. Food, fresh water, repair materials. There are only so many places along that coast to get what they need. Kjell's eyes sharpened with interest. Continue. I could go north. Not as your agent, but as a refugee. A former slave seeking passage to the Shetlands, maybe, or Iceland. I speak the languages, I know ships and sailing. I could get close to them, learn their plans. Absolutely not. The rejection was immediate and firm. I won't send you into that kind of danger. With respect, Your Majesty, you're not sending me. I'm offering. Astrid met his gaze steadily. You gave me freedom when you claimed me as your ward. Let me use that freedom to serve the kingdom. Kjell was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the timber walls like a warning. It's too dangerous, he said finally. These aren't merchants or traders you'd be deceiving. They're hardened warriors who kill first and ask questions later. Then I'll have to be very convincing. Astrid moved closer to the map, pointing to a small island marked north of Bergen. Here, Solent Island. It's perfectly positioned to monitor shipping traffic. And there's a small fishing village that would need to supply any fleet operating in these waters. Moira, the thing lasts 3 days, she pressed on. I could sail north tonight, reach Solent by tomorrow evening, gather intelligence, and return before the assembly concludes. You'd have the information you need to confront the traitors, or prepare for their attack. Kjell walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with reluctance and worry. If I agree to this mad plan, you won't go alone. I'll send Olaf with you disguised as a traitor. That could work, Astrid agreed. A traitor and his interpreter, perhaps? His daughter, Kjell corrected. It would explain your presence and give you both a reason to be asking questions about safe passage. And if we discover they are planning an attack? Then we pray we can get word back before they move. Kjell turned from the window to face her. Moira, I need you to understand something. This mission could expose you to terrible danger. These men think nothing of killing women and children if it serves their purposes. If you're discovered, I understand the risks, Your Majesty. Astrid straightened her shoulders, but I also understand what's at stake. You've given me hope for a different kind of future, not just for me, but for people like me. I won't see that vision destroyed by those who can't imagine change. For a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with king and subject, ward and protector. It was the recognition of two people who shared a vision of what their world could become, and the courage to fight for it. Very well, Kjell said quietly. God help us both, but I accept your offer. We'll prepare your departure for tonight. The cover of darkness will help hide your movements. As plans took shape around the flickering lamplight, neither of them noticed the shadow that lingered just beyond the doorway, or the soft footsteps that retreated into the maze of corridors. The gathering storm was more complex than either realized, and the greatest dangers might come from those they least suspected. The wind howled louder outside, as if the very air sensed the approaching conflict. Within hours, Astrid would be sailing north into unknown dangers, carrying with her the hopes of a king and the future of a kingdom balanced on the edge of civil war. The fishing boat rocked gently in the pre-dawn darkness as Astrid and Olaf approached Solent Island, its rocky shores barely visible through the October mist. 3 days of careful navigation had brought them north undetected, following merchant routes and avoiding the main shipping channels where unfriendly eyes might spot them. There, Olaf whispered, pointing toward a cluster of lights in a protected cove. Must be 24 ships at least. Astrid squinted through the gloom, her heart sinking as she counted the vessels. Longships, supply barges, and what looked like several captured merchant vessels pressed into service. This was no raiding party, it was an invasion fleet. We need to get closer, she said quietly. Learn who's leading them, what their target is. As they guided their small boat toward the fishing village, Astrid rehearsed their cover story once more. Olaf was Bjorn the trader, seeking passage to the Shetland Islands for his daughter Astrid, who needed to reach distant relatives there. It was simple enough to be believable, complex enough to explain why they were asking questions. The village was bustling despite the early hour. Warriors moved between the ships and shore carrying supplies and weapons. The sight made Astrid's stomach clench. She recognized some of the faces from King Kjell's own court. "Stay close," Olaf murmured as they tied up their boat. "And remember, you're a frightened girl seeking safe passage, nothing more." They'd barely stepped onto the wooden dock when a voice called out behind them. "You there?" "Traitor." They turned to see a large man approaching, his armor marking him as someone of importance in this gathering. Astrid's blood went cold as she recognized him. Jarl Magnus, one of King Kjell's most vocal critics. "Lord Jarl," Olaf said carefully, offering a respectful bow. "Bjorn Eriksson at your service. I seek passage north for my daughter here." Magnus looked them over suspiciously. Strange timing for travel. Most folk are preparing for winter, not sailing into it. "Family obligations," Olaf replied smoothly. "The girl's aunt is dying in the Shetlands. Her mother insists she be there for the passing." Magnus's gaze fell on Astrid, and she forced herself to look nervous and overwhelmed. Not difficult given the circumstances. "What's your daughter's name?" "Astrid, my lord," she said in a small voice, using her adopted name rather than risk recognition as Lady Moira. "And you can vouch for them both?" Magnus asked a man standing nearby, apparently the local leader. "Arrived this morning, my lord. Been asking about safe passage, willing to pay fair rates. Seem harmless enough." Magnus nodded slowly. "Very well, but you'll wait like everyone else." "No ships leave until after tomorrow night." "Tomorrow night?" Olaf asked. "Is there some celebration planned?" The Jarl's smile was cold and satisfied. "You could say that. By tomorrow's end, there will be much to celebrate indeed." As Magnus walked away, Astrid caught Olaf's eye and saw her own concern reflected there. Whatever was planned would happen tomorrow, during the final day of the Thing assembly. They spent the morning carefully gathering information, posing as worried travelers eager to understand the delays. Bit by bit, a terrifying picture emerged. The fleet would sail tomorrow at sunset, timing their arrival at Bergen for the following dawn, when the Thing would be concluding and many of the Jarls preparing to depart. But it wasn't an attack on Bergen itself. They were planning it was something far more insidious. They intended to blockade the harbor and present King Kjell with an ultimatum. Abandon his reforms and return to the old ways, or watch his kingdom's trade lifeline be strangled. "Brilliant," Olaf muttered as they huddled over a meal of fish stew in the village's single inn. They avoid direct treason by not attacking the king himself, but they force his hand completely. "And if he refuses?" Astrid asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Then they wait for winter to do their work for them. No trade means no imported grain, no vital supplies, no revenue to pay loyal warriors. By spring, either Kjell accepts their terms or faces rebellion from desperate people." Astrid pushed her food around her bowl, her appetite gone. "We have to get word back tonight." "Agreed. But there's another problem." Olaf nodded toward the window where storm clouds were gathering on the southern horizon. "That weather system has been building all day. We'll be sailing directly into it." As if summoned by his words, the inn door burst open and a sailor stumbled inside, his clothes soaked with spray. "Bad blow coming in from the southwest," he announced to the room. "Anyone thinking of sailing south tonight better think again. Those are killing winds building out there." Astrid felt her heart sink. Even if they left immediately, they'd never outrun the storm, and fighting through those waters in their small boat would likely mean death for both of them. "There might be another way," she said slowly, a desperate idea forming in her mind. "I don't like that tone," Olaf warned. "The messenger birds. I noticed a dovecote behind the inn. They must use carrier pigeons for communication with other settlements." Olaf's eyes widened. "You want to send intelligence via bird message? That's incredibly risky. If it's intercepted, if we don't try, King Kjell walks blindly into their trap tomorrow." Astrid leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I can write the message in the old runes my grandmother taught me. Even if it's intercepted, it will take them time to find someone who can read it. And if there's no one in Bergen who can translate, Lady Sigrid can. I've seen the books in her chambers. She studies the old ways." They spent the afternoon making preparations, carefully observing the dovecote's routine and identifying which birds were most likely to reach Bergen successfully. As evening approached and the storm winds began to howl, Astrid carefully carved her message onto a thin piece of bark using a sequence of runes that told the entire story. The fleet's size, leadership, timing, and intentions. "Ready?" Olaf asked as they crept through the rain toward the bird enclosure. Astrid nodded, though her hand shook as she attached the message to the pigeon's leg. This bird carried not just intelligence, but the hopes of a kingdom and the future she'd dared to dream since becoming the king's ward. The pigeon disappeared into the storm-dark sky, and they could only pray it would reach Bergen before the trap was sprung. "Now what?" Olaf asked as they returned to the inn. "Now we wait," Astrid replied, watching the southern horizon where lightning flickered among the clouds, "and pray we haven't just signed our own death warrants." But even as the storm raged around them and enemy warriors prepared for battle, Astrid felt a strange sense of completion. She had chosen her path freely, not as a slave driven by fear, but as a woman who had found something worth fighting for. Whatever came next, she would face it as Lady Moira, ward of the king, and defender of a vision that valued mercy alongside strength. The wind howled its ancient song of change coming to the north, and somewhere in Bergen, a king waited for word that would determine the fate of his kingdom. The choice had been made, the message sent, and now the storm would decide who would emerge victorious when the morning sun rose over Norway's troubled waters. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or catastrophe. But tonight, Astrid allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had kept her promise to use her freedom wisely, and whatever the cost, she had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the chains of the past.